Welcome, everybody, once again. I am Rebecca Weston from the Camino Calls, and I am thrilled to be here today with my guest, Dave Whitson, who I have been following for quite a long time now, way back after my first Camino. And was delighted at one point earlier to be on his podcast. Dave Whitson, just to give you a little background about who he is, he's walked dozens of pilgrimage routes actually around the world and other walking trails as well. He's the host of the Camino podcast, which is, from what I could find, the longest running Camino podcast out there. And he's done tons of conversations on that podcast and a lot that dig into the meaning of Camino and all kinds of different aspects of the Camino de Santiago, not just talking to people who have done it, but interviewing experts, historians, even a bed bug expert at one point. His newest book is called The Camino Compendium, and that book goes through the Camino Frances, the most popular route of the Camino. But he takes us through historical and cultural aspects of the Camino Frances. But the book that I've most recently read of his, which is a little bit older, is called Pilgrimage, A Medieval Cure for Modern Ills. And I love that title, which we'll get to in a minute. I wanted to have him here, especially too, because he wrote a book all about pilgrimage, but doesn't consider himself religious. And so I know some people, there's concerns about the Camino de Santiago. It does have a religious history. That's how it began. But today, I like to let people know it's not specifically religious. There are people that do it for a variety of reasons. So we're going to get into that as well. But my first question, Dave, how did you get pulled into the Camino de Santiago web as it was? How did that all come about?
Hi, Rebecca. Thanks for having me here. I was in my first year out of university. I had saved up to be able to travel. I had never left the United States aside from Canada, which when you grow up in Seattle is right next door. So I knew that I wanted to spend a year traveling before I went and got a job. And so I did the stereotypical 3 months backpack around Europe with a rail pass thing. I traveled around Mexico, and I still had enough money in the spring to do one more trip. And I was already burned out on sightseeing. I had seen some of the most beautiful things in the world, and I didn't want to do it again. And so I was trying to figure out, like, what is travel that is not tourism? What is travel that is not sightseeing? And these days, there's more sort of niche tourism options that go beyond sightseeing. In 2001, 2002, those weren't as developed yet. So I remember it was pre-Google, right? Like I was Alta Vista-ing, trying to figure out what options were out there. And I think I ended up finding a post on like a Rick Steves Europe Through the Back Door message board. Someone saying, if you really want to find a European back door, try the Camino. And it immediately ignited that's what I was looking for. Because I knew I was going to be a history teacher. And so what could be better than literally walking through history, seeing these places that, because of the lack of economic development in northern Spain, had been untouched for such a long time, and to be able to engage in this human tradition that has gone on for centuries, for millennia. And so it was just an automatic hit.
Gotcha. Wonderful. And it's funny you mentioned Rick Steves, because when I first heard about the Camino, it was back in the day where you would walk into a bookstore to get information. And I would always go right to the travel section, and I would look up books on Spain, and I would look in the index for Camino de Santiago. And there was always maybe a paragraph or two about the Camino. And I was just so intrigued. You couldn't get a Camino de Santiago guidebook without special ordering it back then. So yeah, it was definitely, you were back in 2000, 2001. I was a dozen years after that. So you saw the Camino before it had become what it is today. What are some things, just a couple of things that you could tell us about? I know it's changed quite a bit, but what are some of the things that you think have changed the most about the Camino since that first time?
Bear with me 1 second. There's a ringing phone.
No problem. No problem.
Apologies. I am house sitting for my mom, and she has a landline. It's hard to believe there's
Oh
such
my.
a thing as a landline still. I know, um, and actually an answering machine that goes off. So
Oh my
apologies for
gosh,
that.
it's so funny.
Yeah,
It's
I
so
know.
funny.
What a world.
And we're
Um,
speaking about the past on the Camino. So yeah, that this was
oh
back
yeah,
then. Yeah.
oh yeah. It's in the past. So it'll get past us here in a second. We uh, I I was already like kind of into the present. I would say I was into the boom because, um, you know, lots of people were already walking. I think the '90s is where it really took off. So I see myself post boom,
Okay.
or in the early sort of explosion. But what one thing I can say that really stands out to me. So I walked in that first time alone, and then immediately I was just like, I'm going to be a high school teacher. I'm going to bring my students here, and so I organized that, and I brought students back to the Camino. And so we walked the first time, and you can imagine I've got a group of like 14 people. We're staying in municipal albergues, and so we're walking every day, getting there, and we're able to get beds most of the time. There was a holy year, and they had tents set up in Galicia, so we slept in military tents a couple times. But the second group, when we were walking through Galicia, I discovered there was such a thing as a private albergue that offered reservations in Arzua, because we had to like sneak the entire group into two hotel rooms in Porto Marine. Like that was the only place
Okay.
we could get shelter for the night. And so I was like, wow, we can reserve beds on the Camino. That's crazy. So that's my snapshot of the before times.
Yeah, yeah, and now today, like I work with people who specifically want to stay in private rooms and private
Sure.
bathrooms and things, and that's an option now. Whereas when I did my first Camino, I didn't even know that was an option. Like you, I was like, oh my gosh, you could actually do that. So yeah, it's definitely it changed quite a bit. But I and yeah, and so but it's wonderful to see that there's now so many ways to do the Camino, and I it's one of the things I love about it is that there are a lot of options no matter how you wanna do it, so,
Yeah.
um so I, first learned of you through the Camino podcast. I came back from my Camino and was, looking for more, and you've now produced over 100 episodes of that Camino podcast, and as I mentioned before, one of the longest running, Camino podcasts out there. What prompted you to start that podcast originally, and what's kept you going?
Yeah, longest running and slowest outputting. 100 episodes sounds good, but when it's spread over 10 years, it's a little bit less impressive. It's like a HBO series. But when I started it, the simple reality is that I was teaching classes where my students weren't limited to kind of traditional essays, and they had a little bit more flexibility. And this was post serial. And so a bunch of my students were just like, can we make a podcast? Can we make a podcast? And I was like, I don't know what the hell goes into a podcast. So then I thought, you know what? At this point in my life, if there's one topic that I have like just enough insight into that I could actually create a podcast on it, it would be pilgrimage. And I looked around and there wasn't anything out there. That's why it's the Camino podcast. And so I just thought, hey, I'll give it a shot. What the heck? And so I did. I went and found a Life Hacker article on, how do you make a podcast? And I bought a cheap microphone, and I emailed the president of American Pilgrims, Cheryl, who was the president at the time, and asked her if she'd talk with me for this show that doesn't exist. And she said yes, and sort of grew it out from there. But it was somewhere around episode 7, 8, 9 where I got Mark Kurlansky and Jack Hitt back to back. And I was just like, I'm just this idiot with a cheap microphone, and I have these two incredible authors who are willing to talk with me. This is wild. And so then that just opened me up to like all of the possibilities out there, all of these people that I had read and admired for years. And over and over again, with very few exceptions, they said yes, 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 yes. So that's the biggest thing that kept me going over the years. There have been, 100 episodes in 10 years. Obviously, I'm not operating at lightning speed. There have been some big lags. There was one big lag in particular. I think it might have been almost 2 full years where I didn't put out an episode because work got crazy. I took on some extra responsibilities. And like people had been emailing me to the Camino podcast email, like, I hope you're not dead. So I try to be very clear these days when there's going to be a lag, just so that people are okay. But what keeps me coming back is in some ways it was liberating when I came back from that and found out that there are a bunch of other Camino podcasts now. And it was just sort of like, I don't have to feel like this podcast has to be all things to all people. I can just sort of make it what I want to be. And I think that the niche I found is moving away from kind of more Camino basics stuff, more Camino intro stuff, which is really important, right? You have so many people coming in year after year, but by year 10, like, it's not quite as exciting to do that from a podcasting perspective. And so I kind of think of it as maybe like Camino 201, Camino 301, where I'm trying to bring in a lot of these different perspectives from academia on pilgrimage, historians, people of all these different backgrounds, along with the more meat and potatoes Camino Frances folks, just to be able to give the people who have done their first Camino, who have gotten their legs under them, something new, something else to dive into.
Mhm. And that is one of the things that I've definitely appreciated about your podcast, and it's one of the reasons I recommend it to anyone who's watching this, is because of that diversity of guests, diversity of topics that you won't necessarily find if you just Google the Camino de Santiago necessarily. So I definitely love that about what you've been doing as far as the podcast goes. Let's dig into some of your books because in you've started the podcast and then you got into writing some guidebooks. Tell us how that came about. That you have written guidebooks on the Camino del Norte, the Camino Inglés, the Via Podiensis. Tell us a little bit about how you got started there.
Guidebook actually came before the podcast. The guidebook happened because the first one it was called the Northern Caminos at the time, and it ended up having the Norte, the Primitivo, and the Inglés all squeezed into this one book because the publisher said, "I don't know where else we're going to put an Inglés book, so let's shove that in there as well. That's on the north; it fits Northern Caminos." But it just all went back to the fact that I was leading students on the Camino. And so we had done the Camino Frances a few times, and we'd done the Via Francigena quite unsuccessfully one time. It was more successful when we ultimately came back later. And then I just sort of thought, like, I don't need to go back to the Camino Frances right away. So what's next? And the Camino del Norte and Primitivo at that point had developed enough to make them viable. So I went and I walked those solo. And then, leading students, I developed trip notes. And on the Frances, it was easy. You just buy Gitlitz and Davidson and you're good to go. Nothing was like that for the Norte. So it was a more laborious process gathering information. And there wasn't a major English language guidebook at that point. The Confraternity of St. James in the UK had a guide, but it hadn't been updated for a while. And the Norte in those years, it was just constantly changing. So I sent an email to Cicerone and I said, "Hi, I don't know what I'm doing, but I've got some information and you don't have a book." And they said, "Hey, here, you want to write a book?" So that really, it was that simple. I wrote an email, got a response, and we had a conversation. And before long, I had a contract. And my fellow chaperone, Laura, co-authored that one with me at the time, and it's just gone from there. And it was a fantastic experience. I did that one, then we split off the Inglés, and that gave me the opportunity to put the Ruta do Mar, which was a developing Camino that nobody had ever heard of, in there. And just thought it was awesome to be able to perform that service, to try to bring attention to this route, to give it life. And then I said, no more guidebooks. I felt good. And then the Via Podiensis opened up and I said, yes, I'll do that one.
Gotcha. And speaking of guidebooks, let's talk about then your your most recent book because you hadn't written anything specifically about the Camino Frances at that point. However, what we do, the Camino Frances is the most, still remains to this day the most popular route. And what had you finally dig into writing something about the Camino Frances? And tell us a little bit about that book because it is not here's how to do the Camino Frances. I really like what it is. So explain to our audience what that book is and how you decided to do that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's good business, certainly doing the like I can never be accused of being a good businessman because, writing guidebooks on less traveled routes, doing podcast episodes on pilgrimage that leaves the Camino behind, you can just see the clicks go down, right? So on some level, the Camino Frances is good business. But ultimately, what drew me back to it was I had been thinking for years about how leading students on pilgrimage all these years, I had to develop. I wanted there to be curriculum. I wanted there to be content. I wanted them to learn beyond just the informal learning that happens when you're walking a Camino. And so we'd have group meetings every night, and I'd try to figure out like how do you tell a deeper story about what's happening, what we're seeing today. Try to make something on the route live a little bit more. And so I developed these, mini lectures that we'd do in the evening, long enough to be substantial, but short enough that I didn't have all the students keeling over and falling asleep in the middle of the meeting. It's bad for my self-esteem. And so I had some things to work with. In the end, practically none of that got used for the book, but I had this idea that I already had some building blocks in place for the Camino Frances because I again led three student groups on the Camino Frances before I shifted my attention elsewhere. The other part of it is on the last guidebook I wrote when I was writing the Via Podiensis guidebook. I spent a couple weeks reading books on like the Hundred Years' War, the Wars of Religion, the French Revolution. Like I was diving into all the Albigensian Crusade. I had all this information, and I knew, of course, that it's not all going to fit into the book. But I wrote kind of a mini essay for the intro. The heading was a concise history of French destruction. And in the end, by the time the editors were done with it, it's like one of those tiny Cicerone guidebook pages, and I think even the title was condensed down to something like French Wars or, something meager like that. And I was outraged. And they were right, of course. From a guidebook perspective, you can't go into that level of detail. But for me, that sealed the deal that there is a missing piece. I haven't done anything about the Camino Frances because there are no more guidebooks needed, right? Like the guidebook market is saturated. You have great options. Like I'm not diving into that. And I'm not writing a memoir. Like I'm not writing a memoir of me walking a Camino. I just don't think I have anything to add to the discussion. Again, the market is saturated. If you need to write your memoir because you need to get it out, that's one thing. That I'm not looking to do that. I'm a private person. I don't push myself out there in a lot of different ways. So but what's missing is that sort of mid-range perspective. You have those granular books like the guidebooks and Gitlitz and Davidson that will tell you exactly what is going on with that building. And you have these larger memoirs that dive into it from a personal perspective. But there's nothing that says like, yeah, there's a lot of eucalyptus trees around. What's up with the eucalyptus? Or Oreos. There are all of these corn cobs all around Galicia. And so it feels historic, it feels traditional, but corn's not native to Europe either. So what's the background there? And the great church in Fromista, everyone loves it. This incredible church. But there's a deep story there. Like it was completely refurbished at the beginning of the 20th century, completely transformed. So all of those stories are missing from the discussion because they can't fit in the guidebook. And if people are writing a memoir, they're not writing a history. And it's really time consuming to dive into this stuff. So that's what I was trying to do. I wanted to write something that adds to the discussion. And even if I'm not driven to constantly go back to the Camino Frances today, it was formative, right? Like I spent a lot of time on that. I can still visualize every part of it. And the power of it is that there are so many historical layers to it that there's a ton to unpack.
There is. There is. Absolutely. And for those of you that are just joining us, my guest today is Dave Whitson, who is, gosh, he's been around with the Camino de Santiago for years, hosts a podcast, has numerous guidebooks and other books like the one we were just talking about, which is his Camino Compendium. And I'm delighted that he's joining us here today to share his Camino knowledge, his background. And one of the things that I did specifically want to dig into is the book that I have been reading as of late, which is called Pilgrimage: A Medieval Cure for Modern Ills. First of all, I love the title. And it, the idea behind this book, from in my perspective, is that you're suggesting that there's this ancient practice of walking pilgrimage that can be kind of an antidote to some of these modern afflictions that we have. So, the digital overwhelm, the burnout, the restlessness we have these days. And you write that there's a lot of strategies for overcoming all of these things, but two of the most powerful are really pretty simple, and it's to get outside and to walk. Um, but what I love about this book, about the pilgrimage book, is that you combined people's stories about pilgrimages around the world, with research about all kinds of topics. And so, my first question is, what kind of discoveries along the way in this journey to writing this book surprised you?
Yeah, yeah, a lot of things. You know, as you said, what I wanted to do in this book is sort of bridge the gap, because there is all of this research that exists on the state of the world and the maladies, the challenges in which we find ourselves. So that's there, and I wanted to sort of paint a picture of what is, not what we think, but what the data actually says about the current state of affairs. And then there's all of this research being done in academia about pilgrimage, including, some quantitative data, just some rigorously studied phenomena about pilgrimage all around the world. So not just the Camino de Santiago, not just walking pilgrimage even, but pilgrimage explored in all kinds of different contexts. And most of us walking the Camino never dive into what is being discussed and explored in academia. And then there is this wealth of data that exists in pilgrim memoirs, this qualitative data that then can speak to or illustrate the quantitative stuff. And so my goal was to bring those things together in dialogue. And in terms of what I was surprised by, I would say, I mean, we all know that being in nature is powerful. I don't think we appreciate just how powerful it is. The study that always stands out as the exemplar is the study of patients in hospital rooms, some of whom have a window that allows them to see a tree, just a tree, and those who don't. And those who have that view of a tree actually heal better. So that's a little example, but there's just a wealth of data out there on how powerful it is for us to be in nature, and how rarely we actually allow ourselves to be in nature as humans today. The second is, I've always just sort of operated with the assumption that spirituality is a good thing. And I think I grew up in a context where religion is kind of icky because it has this stain of authority, of power over it, and this idea that that power ruins it all. And so, this idea of kind of an individualized a la carte spirituality is implicitly good. We've liberated ourselves from the shackles of power. And a lot of the research on spirituality actually raises some questions about it. And the analogy I use in the book is, it's kind of like orange juice, that we think when we're drinking orange juice that we're doing something healthy, but we've actually stripped it of the good stuff, the fiber and a lot of the other things that we would get just from eating oranges. And there are some questions about, to what degree does spirituality do that versus religion? And then the third example I'd give you is just how powerful awe is. I had never dived into awe, and there's a whole field of emerging research on awe that says, like, this is one of the most powerful things that we can try to engage with as humans, that has all of these powerful effects that help to ameliorate some of those challenges that we're facing today.
I want to dig into that topic of awe, because that is something that I really enjoyed reading about this book. And the first thing I want to say is how tricky it is to even come up with a definition of what it is. Um,
Yeah.
but one of the things that you talk about there is uh, that there's this relationship between awe and nature. Um, and I love, to make it really simple. At one point, you just say nature is awesome. We should spend more time in it. But what is can for our people that are watching us, how would you even describe awe? And can you give us an example, either from your life or on the Camino de Santiago? Can you dig into this concept of awe a little bit more?
Yeah. Uh, well, let's talk about awe in the specific context of nature, because
Okay.
I think that our minds would immediately go to awe being that incredible view from a mountaintop, right? When you are staring out at that sprawling vista, maybe like O Sobrero, you're staring down into Galicia, an incredible sight. Maybe you're on the coast and you just see the waves crashing into the shore. And so nature affords us like a really good concrete example in those ways, where part of what's happening is you feel very small. You are in these larger forces of nature unfolding all around you, and you feel small. When we talk about feeling small today, it's usually in a negative context, right? You feel small when someone has demeaned you. But this is a very good kind of small, the small self effect, where we're less focused on ourselves. We're less hyper conscious. We're more thinking about how we fit into this larger phenomenon. And that actually is quite liberating when you start looking at some of the positives of awe, that it relieves us from the time crunch. It promotes pro-social values. You can see that happening there because we're not an island. We are part of this larger web, this larger network. But you can also experience awe in nature on a smaller scale. Like when you really zoom in and look at that plant, when you look at how the leaves are radiating outward, when you look really closely at a flower. And so I think sometimes when people hear about awe in nature, they think, okay, that sounds great, but it's only going to work when I make the time to drive out to that really spectacular thing. But the reality is that if we are perceptive and attentive, we can tap into awe in a natural context over and over and over again. It's all around us. It's right next door.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to be on the Camino de Santiago even to experience this awe in nature. And it's one of the things I do like about the Camino is it gives you this time and this space to kind of experience life a little bit differently. Like I was just on Camino a few weeks ago, and I sat there and watched some little, I don't even know what kind of bug it was. It looked like some sort of scorpion, but that wasn't the point. I mean, I saw it. I was like, this is really weird. What is this thing doing here? And I just sat and watched the thing for a little while, took a picture of it. Somebody came by and they joined me in watching this thing. And where is this thing? So just I love that you bring up the fact that awe is not just this big all-encompassing kind of awe, but the Camino even when I go out on my daily walks, there are times where I notice. I feel like it also is somehow connected to this noticing of something that I don't know that we would notice if we didn't slow down to a walk specifically. And in nature, even better, because there's so much there to see and engage with, even if you're walking down a road and looking at the trees on the side of the road.
I mean, this is always my response when people ask me about Camino magic. I'm a skeptic, and so I don't think that there is this tangible thing called Camino magic. But related to what you were just saying, we slow down on the Camino. We are more attentive. We are noticing things. And so the answer is not that Camino magic exists, but rather that magic exists all around us all the time, but we structure our lives in ways where we are not attentive to those things.
Mm. Exactly. Oh, I love that. I love that. And I feel like that's why, I mean, I've met a lot of people on Camino, Europeans usually, who say, "Oh, I come on Camino every year." They do at least a week on the Camino de Santiago for a reflective time, for a reset. And I feel like that gets into part of that there are these things that we can experience in our everyday lives that we don't for various reasons. And sometimes it helps to get out of our normal day to day to remind us of these things. But to your point, you don't have to be on Camino to do that. But the Camino does provide this container, if you will, for things like that.
Yeah, the researchers call it like the Camino being in a liminal space. You are outside of the norm. You are kind of in this in-between zone. And that liberates us. That opens up all kinds of possibilities because we are not bound by our daily schedule. And so that's helpful just in terms of a time management perspective, but it also separates us potentially from nationality, from race, from class, from all of the different like social markers that might separate us from one another. There is a leveling effect on the Camino that also adds to this.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things whenever anybody asks, especially people that haven't done it before, they'll say, "Well, what do you love about the Camino?" My number one answer is people, because I love the connections that we make with people that I would never pretty much meet in any other way. This many people from this many places, this many walks of life. It's a very unusual context, what the Camino de Santiago offers to people that walk it.
I mean, the famous example is Malcolm X, who went on Hajj to Mecca and had been skeptical that a multiracial state could exist in America. But when he went to Mecca and he saw all of these different Muslims coming from all around the world joined together in this way, it changed him. And so it's absolutely the case that we are thrust together in community. I mean, my I have this vivid memory, my first Camino, I was in my early 20s. I remember lying in a bunk, the bunk beds all crammed together in a municipal albergue. And there were 60, 70-year-olds on either side of me performing triage on their feet. And I realized, like, these are my peers. These are my colleagues. And I didn't realize going in how that was going to be the case. But again, leveling effect. We were just pilgrims. So we were all operating on the same level, the same physical challenges. Well, maybe a little different if you're 60 versus 20, but still same concept. And
Yeah.
so all of that unfolds on the road.
Yeah, yeah, it does, and I love that it unfolds, uh, no matter how you're doing the Camino. Like, yes, there's a special thing that happened in the albergues, but even if you're staying I've done, Caminos with people staying in private rooms, I've done a mix of both things, and I remember the first Camino I went on with my father, who was 70 something at the time, and we just had some incredible experiences, as you pretty much always do on Camino. And he kind of, went back over those experiences and he said, is it always like this? Like, was this Camino more special than other ones you've done? And of course it was more special. It was my first one with my father. But that experience of having these amazing encounters with people, I said to him, it happens every time. And it's one of the many reasons I keep going back. But to your point about awe and how you can experience awe in your everyday life, this is another thing about the Camino that I love is you kind of step back and realize no, there are pretty amazing experiences that happen every day in my life. But to your point, we don't necessarily stop and slow down and recognize them as such. And it's one of the things that I've been considering a lot lately is that whole process of bringing the Camino back into your day-to-day life. And so, I have a question for you kind of off the cuff here, but I know that's the adjustment post-Camino. You have obviously done it multiple times now, but there is some, I don't know if discontent's the word. It can be challenging for people post Camino to come back into their day to day life. Do you have any experiences of that or recommendations for, first of all, in your research, why that is, as you've done so much research for this book, and second of all, anything that you recommend to people?
I was speaking with Brendan McManus about this topic the other day. That podcast will go out next week. He's written a book about coming back home, trying to bring the lessons back home from an Ignatian perspective. A while back, I spoke with Alexander John Shaya, who's also written a book about this. And I really like his concept of thinking about either Santiago, Finisterre, Muxia as the midway point, the halfway point, as opposed to the end. That we, as modern pilgrims, we've lost the walk home, and so we've lost that opportunity to reflect on the experience, prepare for reentry. It's just almost immediate that you finish and you're home and bam, there's no time for it. The current theory or notion that I'm working with about it is I just think we set ourselves up for failure by not defining terms and being very clear in our own minds what we mean. What would it be? What would it look like if we were successful at bringing the Camino home? What would that look
Mm.
like? because I don't think most people want to come home and walk 15 miles or whatever every day. I don't think they want to sleep in bunk beds every day. So, what is the concrete thing that we are looking to bring back while also being realistic about the aspects of our lives that we don't want to change? Right? That there are certain things that are not Camino at home that are also non negotiable. We are going to keep those because we like those even if they are different. And so I think just being really clear in our minds about what that is going to entail. So one way I bring the Camino home is just I structure my life around being able to walk. I don't take a job or live in a place where it would mean that I am driving to work every day. So it's a 2.5 mile walk at my last school to get to and from school, which meant I had 2.5 miles to get to work, 2.5 miles to get home. And then if I go for a run in the evening or whatever, like all of a sudden I'm at, 10 miles. And like, so it's my lifestyle because what I realized is like I do all of my thinking while I'm walking. So if I'm planning a class, like I'm planning that class on my walk home. The intellectual work is done. I just have to, make some slides or some notes or whatever. So that's
Mhm,
one very concrete way where I was just like, I'm going to bring this practice home with me. But if you're worried about losing community, then like you figure out, okay, how am I going to replicate the communal aspect of the Camino in a very particular way when I get home? So to me, that's the biggest thing is like, let's move away from the mushiness. Let's move away from this sort of intangible notion of bringing the Camino home. And let's just set one or two very concrete goals that we can change that will fit in with everything else that we're not going to change.
mhm. Thank you for that. I love hearing that perspective, and I think it's the conversation we don't talk enough about in Camino circles. There's tons of stuff about preparing for the Camino and what Camino route should you do, and if I get one more question about the shoes, I'm like, choosing your Camino shoes is as different as like, choosing your life partner. I mean, it's you can't just put a question out there and get the answer. But I love that there are these other things that I think are important to have as part of the discussion, and I appreciate your perspective on that, and that's definitely a piece I'm going to be, like, going back to this recording to listen to again and to kind of process, especially for the people, that I am gonna be working with to bring on Camino. And in fact, somebody just mentioned I'm going on another Camino in October with a small group, and this is part of the process when I go with people is post Camino, because it's a whole other level, that is not considered as much. So I appreciate you having that conversation with us here and kind of talking to some things to think about there. For me, at various times, yeah, I've brought back walking, daily walking into my life. I know a lot of people talk about they come home and after living with so little, you don't need very much in the Camino. They come home and clean out closets and all kinds of stuff, and then kind of commit to a life of a simpler life in the sense of the stuff. Because I think, especially for us Americans, consumerism is a huge thing, and to kind of step back from that, that's something that the Camino has definitely inspired in me for sure. Um, so my the n and we're almost out of time here, but I do wanna, so we've touched for those of you that are just joining us, um we're here with my one of my I'm most excited so far to have Dave Whitson with me. He has done has is the host of the Camino podcast. He's written books on the Camino, guidebooks, led groups on the Camino. And one of the things I want to know, Dave, is what's next for you. From what I understand, you've left your teaching work for the time being. So tell us what's coming up, because quite a few projects you have in the hopper. I don't know where that phrase just came from, but so tell us tell us
Yeah.
what's coming up here.
Yeah, the hopper is full. So, yeah, I left my teaching job at the end of the last school year, and it was just time to tackle new challenge. One of the things that happened was I had taken a sabbatical during the year that became the COVID year, and I was going to walk across the US, and so that walk was interrupted by COVID. And so I still had 4 more months of walking to finish to make it across the US coast to coast. And so I did that in the fall, and you know, I I I don't know what I want to do next. Like if I want to go back to teaching, if I don't want to go back to teaching, but I wanted to carve out a chunk of time so that I could walk and that I could write and then see what happens. So one of the things I've been working on lately is I've just been sequestered trying to figure out what on earth I'm going to do with this book about the US walk. And so I mean, it's massive. Like it's so many months of walking and so much to dive into. And also requires engaging with American politics to some degree, which is, nightmare fuel. So there's that. But then it was like, okay, I've done the walk across the US. What's the next big walk? Because like, right, part of the idea is I don't want to wait until I'm 65, 70 to do really big walks. Like right now I'm still kind of at my walking peak, so I might as well tackle some big challenges now. It doesn't make sense to wait another 20 years. Plus, climate change, God only knows what. It's just hard to think about. So I'm going to do it now. And after walking through the American Midwest twice, I earned myself some more diverse terrain to walk through. So I decided I was going to walk across Italy. I was going to walk across Italy twice. So in the spring, I walked Italy from south to north, following a bunch of different pilgrim roads, the Via Francigena Sud, the Benedicto, the Francesco, the Antonio. Ended up on the Slovenian border. In 9 days, I'm going back to Italy to walk north to south, so crossing the Swiss Alps and then eventually ending up on Sicily. And part of the concept is, you know, it's uh, it's a jubilee year, so it's a very special year in Italy. So being in Italy throughout that time, grappling with the theme of the year, which is hope, ended up being the year that Pope Francis died, new pope coming in, so being there during all of that happening. Italy is an interesting comparison point to the US, so sort of having that in mind. And then, from here I need to go back and rewalk a lot of the routes for the guidebooks. So that's what I'll do in the spring is I'll go back and work on the Norte, always trying out new variants there. Like that's the biggest thing. And then yeah, writing. So writing a book about the U.S., writing a book about the Italy, 6 months, and we'll see.
And you bring up some stuff about the Pope and about religion and the Holy Year and stuff like that. And I'm realizing like one of the big things I wanted to ask you about, because the conversation kind of went all these
Yeah.
different wonderful ways, but was about specifically religion as it relates to pilgrimage, because I think a lot of people mistakenly think that the Camino de Santiago and these other pilgrimage routes are only for people who are specifically religious or for that specific religion. So can you talk a little bit to the research in your book on pilgrimage, and what you discovered about, first of all, let's dispel the myth. You do not have to be religious to do the Camino de Santiago. But can you talk a little bit more about that idea of religion and the Camino, and to what extent there's the connection? Clearly, there's the history, but
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say like the Camino is a Catholic pilgrimage route, right? Like it has a long tradition there. And it's also fair to note that like in its resurgence, it has been quite deliberately marketed as an all-inclusive route. And that's including by the church. Like the church is fine with this. If the church were not fine with this, then they would impose greater restrictions. It would be complicated and difficult, but they could find ways to make it at least harder or make it feel a little bit less welcoming, right? Like there are pilgrimages out there that are exclusive. The Hodge is exclusive. I don't blame the Hodge for being exclusive. I wouldn't blame the Archbishop in Santiago for wanting to make the Camino a little bit more Catholic centric. I could understand why, because in some ways I feel almost like the Catholicism has been diluted out of it. Like reflecting on it, I feel like the sort of secular or new agey pilgrims have sort of taken over a lot of the tenor of things in places. I mean, I think back to when I started walking, like the most popular Camino books at the time, or the ones that showed up most prominently, were Shirley MacLaine and Paulo Coelho. So like the new age focus was strong then, and you could feel it in a lot of the albergues that's what was drawing people to the Camino at the time. So yeah, I mean the Camino is very, very welcoming. People sometimes don't their default assumptions. Like I've been walking in Italy, and so the most common question I get from my hosts in Italy is, "Are you Catholic or Protestant?" Right? Like those are the two options. So There are some other options out there. So, but when I say I'm neither, then I don't get kicked out, and we have some conversations. I think there's an interesting discussion. I saw someone in the Camino forum recently, um, asking like, can I walk the Camino without, while avoiding all of the religious stuff? Can I just avoid
Yeah.
it? And like, in a sense, you can, right? Like, you don't have to go into the churches. There aren't a lot of people along the, like, if you don't go to parochial albergues, there's not a lot of people foisting stuff on you. Spain is a Catholic country, so you're not going to avoid seeing church stuff around. But like, if you don't want to engage with it, you don't have to. My response as a secular person is that feels like kind of a waste. Like, for me, the one of the big motivations to walk the Camino was that I had grown up secular. I had grown up negative towards religion. And that I mean, quite explicitly, like, I was prejudiced against religious people. And I don't think that's terribly unusual in the Pacific Northwest. I think we often judge religious people to be less intelligent, more credulous, more superstitious, right? The sort of old fashioned. And so I think for me, as someone who was negative towards religion, and I think people who might want to avoid the religious stuff are carrying some of their own baggage. The great thing about the Camino for me is like, I saw Catholicism in the best possible light. I see it in the best possible light. It's the best way of thinking about how religion can be a force for good in the world and can bring about some really remarkable people, some giving, loving, charitable people. And so that was illuminating and liberating for me. It liberated me from my prejudice, and it allowed me to see the world in a different way.
Wow. Thank you so much for that perspective. I really appreciate. Oh, and again, that's another Dave. I feel like I'm going to go back to this whole interview and watch it all again just to take in your perspective, your knowledge, your wisdom. I just so appreciate you coming here and sharing all of this with us. And so one of the things I want to conclude with is that you stated in your book Pilgrimage, a medieval cure for modern ills, that you want to be a source of inspiration for those who have never gone on pilgrimage or even considered the notion. And I just want to say that you are indeed an inspiration. And I thank you for sharing all of your gifts with the Camino community and community at large over the years. So thank you, of course, for coming and joining me today.
Thank you, Rebecca. I really appreciate it.
Okay, and for those of you that joined us a little late, there is going to be a recording of this interview that's going to come out tomorrow, so you can catch more of us there. I am Rebecca Weston from the Camino Calls, here with my guest Dave Whitson. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next Wednesday, same time, for another guest. Bye. Thanks.